Welcome back, everyone. Today we're taking a deep dive into a truly pivotal week in World War II history, the week of November 6th through the 12th, 1939. Now, at this point, the phony war, as it's often called, is in full swing on the Western Front. But believe me, things are happening, and fast, across Europe and beyond, setting the stage for the truly global conflict that's to come.
You've got that right. This week is all about contrasts, really. You see the horrors of what Nazi occupation was like in Poland, while in Germany itself you have Hitler facing this, well, shocking assassination attempt. Then at the same time, you have tensions rising between Finland and the Soviet Union, which is, signaling the brutal winter war that's on the horizon. And of course, on the Atlantic, the Battle of the Atlantic is picking up steam, showing just how crucial naval power was going to be in this whole thing.
Absolutely. Let's start in Poland, where we see the true face of the Nazi regime becoming more and more apparent. I mean, the occupation, it was horrifying, and the horrors were unfolding daily. On November 6th, the Gestapo, they launched this operation called Sonderaktion Krakau, and they're targeting the very heart of Polish intellectual life.
Yeah, Sonderaktion Krakau. This operation rounded up 183 professors and academics from the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It was a very deliberate move, They wanted to dismantle Polish culture, crush any intellectual resistance. The Nazis knew that to truly control a nation, they had to go after the intellectual elite, the ones who could inspire and lead resistance.
And among those arrested were Professor Stanisław Estricher, a renowned scholar of Polish law, and Professor Antoni Meyer, a respected historian. They were deported to concentration camps, which really, shows the Nazis' aim to just wipe out Polish intellectual life.
Exactly. And on top of this attack on academia, the Nazi occupation was just brutal. Just a few days later, on November 8th, you have 24 Polish civilians massacred by Nazi forces in the village of Dalki. These weren't isolated incidents, these were atrocities, and they showed just how dark life was under Nazi rule.
It's a chilling reminder that this war wasn't just about battles and campaigns. It was about something much darker, the systematic dehumanization and brutalization of entire populations.
Couldn't agree more. And as all of this is going on in Poland, something dramatic happens in Germany in the heart of it all. On November 8th, there's this bomb explosion at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall in Munich. And this is just minutes after Hitler had given his annual speech. The one commemorating the 1923 beer hall putsch.
Yeah, that was shocking. 8 people were killed, 63 injured. It sends shockwaves through Germany and the world. For a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Hitler's hold on power was slipping.
The man behind it all was Johann Georg Elser. He was a carpenter, and he'd been planning this attack for months, all by himself. He secretly hollowed out a pillar, the one right behind Hitler's podium, put a time bomb in there. His goal, to kill Hitler, disrupt the Nazi leadership, maybe even change the course of history.
It's incredible, the level of detail, the daring. He acted alone, no support from any organized resistance. He just felt he had to do something, anything, to stop the Nazis.
Yeah, and while his plan didn't work in the end, it showed there was resistance within Germany. It showed that even with the Nazis in control, some individuals were willing to risk it all to oppose them.
And the bombing, it had consequences for the Nazi regime, too. They used it, of course, for propaganda, portraying it as this cowardly attack, justifying a crackdown on anyone who disagreed with them.
Absolutely. The incident fueled their paranoia. It led to even more surveillance, more repression. They used it to silence any opposition and really to solidify their control.
And all this is happening while another crisis is brewing, this time in Northern Europe. Tensions between Finland and the Soviet Union had been simmering for months, and by November, it was reaching a boiling point.
Yeah, Stalin, he was determined to expand Soviet influence, and he saw Finland as the strategically important buffer zone. They demanded territorial concessions from the Finns, especially around Leningrad, which they saw as vulnerable.
But the Finns, they're a fiercely independent people. They have a history of resisting domination. They refused to give in to the Soviets. They were prepared to defend their sovereignty, even if it meant facing a vastly superior military force.
The negotiations went nowhere, neither side budging. And that set the stage for the Winter War. A conflict that would test Finland's resolve like never before and, of course, capture the attention of the entire world.
And while Europe was edging closer to a wider war, the Battle of the Atlantic, that was already raging. The German Navy, under Admiral Raeder, was determined to cripple British shipping, cut off those vital supply lines from North America.
Right, and the U-boats, those stealthy underwater weapons, they started to prowl the Atlantic, targeting merchant ships that were bringing essential goods to Britain. And one of them, U-41, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Gustav Adolf Mugler, well, they carried out this deadly raid off the Outer Hebrides on November 12th.
U-41 sank two Allied ships, the British trawler Cresswell and the Norwegian tanker Arnekier. That attack, it highlighted just how dangerous the U-boat campaign was becoming, how high the human cost of naval warfare would be.
Absolutely. It showed how important the Atlantic was strategically. Control of the sea lanes was crucial, and the Battle of the Atlantic was just the beginning of this long, brutal struggle for that control. The sinking of those ships, the Cresswell and the Arnekier, they might seem like small events when you look at the whole war, but they show how insidious the U-boat campaign was. It wasn't just about isolated attacks. It was a strategy, a way to cut off supplies to Britain, to starve them into submission.
Yeah, the Battle of the Atlantic, that was a long one, crucial one. It was fought in the vastness of the ocean, and so many lives were lost. And as the U-boats were doing their thing, the situation in Poland, well, it just kept getting worse. The Nazi occupation, it became even more oppressive, and the Jewish population, they suffered the most.
Right. On November 9th, the city of Odu, a big center of Jewish life in Poland, was annexed into the Reich. They renamed it Litzmannstadt. This showed what the Nazis were planning, to absorb these territories, to make them part of a greater German Reich.
And this wasn't just symbolic, was it? It was a key step in their plan, their horrific plan, to remove the Jewish presence from those lands.
Exactly. It was the beginning of a process that would ultimately lead to the Holocaust. And then, just a few days later, on November 12th, the deportations began. Deportations of Jews from those annexed territories.
A major escalation in the persecution.
These deportations, they weren't random acts. This was systematic, calculated. They wanted to isolate the Jews and ultimately to eliminate them from German society. They were ruthless, uprooting entire communities, tearing families apart.
It's chilling how methodical they were. It's a reminder of how insidious the Nazi regime was. It wasn't just hatred driving them. It was this cold, calculated ideology, this vision of reshaping Europe according to their twisted worldview.
Absolutely. And the burning of the Ezra's Israel synagogue in Udu that same day, November 12th, that showed their campaign of cultural destruction. This wasn't just one incident. It was part of a bigger effort to erase Jewish culture, to wipe out their history.
And while all of this is happening in Poland, another event rocks Europe. On November 9th, the Gestapo abducts two British MI6 agents, Major Richard Stevens and Captain S. Payne Best. This happened in Venlo, a Dutch border town.
The Venlo incident, a major victory for German intelligence. It exposed the vulnerabilities of Allied intelligence networks. It was a blow to British espionage in Europe.
The abduction, it was a carefully planned operation. They lured those British agents to a meeting, pretending to be anti-Nazi dissidents.
And it had a chilling effect on intelligence gathering from then on. It created distrust, suspicion. Agents became more cautious, afraid to trust anyone. The fear of infiltration, of being tricked, it was everywhere.
Yeah, the Venlo incident, it showed how effective German counterintelligence was. They infiltrated Allied networks, they anticipated their moves, outmaneuvered them.
That's right. And while the Nazi regime was getting stronger, expanding its power, a small nation in Northern Europe was preparing to stand up to the Soviets. November 12th, the negotiations between Finland and the Soviet Union, they collapsed completely.
The collapse, well, that meant war was coming. Weeks of talking and nothing. Stalin wouldn't budge on his demand for Finnish territory, and the Finns, they refused to give up their sovereignty.
A tragedy for both sides. It led to a conflict that would take so many lives, leave scars that wouldn't heal for a long time.
The world was watching. Finland, a small nation, only 3.7 million people, was going up against the Red Army, one of the biggest, most powerful military forces in the world.
And that upcoming winter war, it would show how resilient the Finns were, how determined it would capture the world's attention. And it would show that the Red Army, well, they weren't invincible, especially when facing a resourceful, determined enemy.
As that week ended, the world was truly on the edge. The events of November 6th and 12th, 1939, they exposed the cracks, the fault lines that would soon erupt into a full-blown war, a war that would engulf Europe and the world. It really was a week of escalating tensions, wasn't it? Missed opportunities for peace, and, well, those ominous signs of what was to come. The phony war, it was clear, couldn't last.
You're right. It's almost ironic that calm on the Western Front while the rest of the world was, well, going through all of this violence, this upheaval. This week was a preview, really, of the global conflict that was about to explode.
As we think back on the events of this week, what stands out to you as particularly significant, in terms of the long-term impact?
Well, a few things, really. The assassination attempt on Hitler, for example. It might seem like a small event, but it had huge consequences. I mean, it made Hitler bolder, it solidified his power, and, well, it fueled his paranoia. That led to even more ruthless policies.
You mentioned that it backfired in a way. Can you talk about that a bit more?
Sure, Ulcer, his goal was to stop Hitler, to stop the bloodshed. But unintentionally, he actually strengthened the Nazi regime. Hitler used it as propaganda, made himself out to be a victim, targeted by enemies everywhere, and that gave him the excuse to crack down even harder, control everything even more.
It's a tragedy, isn't it? An active resistance meant to save lives actually contributes to the violence, the oppression. History's complicated. Good intentions, well, sometimes they have unintended consequences.
Exactly. And another event that had a lasting impact, well, that was the Venlo incident. The abduction of those British agents, it didn't just hurt British intelligence. It affected all Allied espionage operations for the rest of the war.
It created that atmosphere of suspicion, made it harder for Allied intelligence agencies to work. The fear of being infiltrated, of being tricked, it was always there.
And it showed how good the Germans were at counterintelligence. They got into those Allied networks, they set a trap, and it worked.
A real setback for the Allies, one that would have repercussions throughout the war.
Switching gears a bit, let's talk about Finland and the Soviet Union. The breakdown in negotiations, that was a pivotal moment. The failure of diplomacy led to the Winter War, a conflict that would leave its mark on both nations.
It was a real David and Goliath story. The Finnish army, small, not well equipped, going up against the giant that was the Red Army. But they fought bravely, tenaciously, inflicting heavy losses on the Soviets.
The world was watching, amazed by the Finns' determination, their resilience, and the Red Army, well, it exposed some of their weaknesses, especially when it came to fighting in the winter.
Finland lost in the end, had to give up territory to the Soviets. But their resistance, it mattered.
It did. It inspired other nations that were facing the threat of Soviet expansion. It showed that even a small country could stand up to a much larger, more powerful one. The Winter War, it became a symbol of courage, of fighting for freedom, no matter the odds.
And amidst all of this conflict, there were moments of humanity, of compassion. The death of Dr. Norman Bethune, he was a Canadian physician, dedicated to helping the wounded in China. It's a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who strive to make a difference.
Bethune, he was an incredible man, a brilliant surgeon, a tireless advocate for social justice. He believed everyone deserved medical care, no matter who they were, what they believed. His work in China, setting up mobile medical units, training Chinese medical personnel, he saved countless lives.
His dedication to easing suffering, even in a faraway conflict, it's a stark contrast to all the brutality we've been talking about. It shows that even when things are at their worst, human compassion can still shine through.
When we look back on this week, this pivotal week in World War II history, we need to remember that these weren't just events in a history book. These were real lives, millions of them shaped by what happened. The decisions made, the actions taken, the sacrifices, they had a profound impact, an impact that would last throughout the 20th century.
This week reminds us, doesn't it? It reminds us how fragile peace is, how dangerous unchecked ambition can be, and it reminds us that humans are capable of both incredible good and unimaginable evil. We should pay attention to this week, learn from it, as we work to build a world that's more peaceful, more just.
Absolutely. This week shows us that history, well, it's not just dates and facts. It's the lives of people, their choices, their triumphs, their tragedies. When we delve into their stories, we understand what shapes our world and our own place in it.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some insights, some perspectives that will stay with you.
It's been a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.